Before dawn, a resignation reached King Charles that no palace announcement had prepared him for. His private legal counsel, the figure trusted with some of the sovereign's most sensitive personal arrangements, had quit without a farewell meeting, without a transition period, and without explanation. But the resignation was only the beginning. Left inside the council's secured working file was a marked copy of Charles's will, containing changes powerful enough to fracture the royal family. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles knew this was not ordinary paperwork. A private legal counsel is the lawyer who handles a monarch's legal affairs rather than the public business of the crown, while a will is the document directing how privately owned property should be handled after death. That distinction mattered because crown assets belong to the institution and pass by established rules, while the king's private estate can carry choices. The lawyer had spent years helping him navigate that line, protecting family arrangements, personal bequests, and instructions. The monarch opened the working file and stopped at the altered provision. He read it once, then again, and slowly placed the pages on the desk. The wording appeared to restrict Camilla's future control over part of a significant private collection, while giving stronger protection to William and Catherine. The Queen Consort watched his face tighten before asking what had happened. He did not answer. Instead, he closed the folder, and her silence sharpened into fear because she understood one thing: her name was somewhere inside those pages. Camilla pressed him again, but Charles only said that the council had resigned overnight and cleared the office before anyone could question him. That was when the departure felt less like exhaustion and more like a warning. Near one disputed clause, the lawyer had left a handwritten notation showing he had objected to a change shortly before walking away. The objection had not been erased. It had been preserved. William became the king's next call that morning. Charles asked the prince to come privately, offering no explanation. Yet before the future king arrived, Camilla reopened the file and found her name repeated across several contested passages. Catherine's position appeared beside William's in protections that went further than either had been told. The Queen Consort looked back at her husband, and this time he could not hide what the document had done to him. And when William finally entered the room, he was walking into far more than a discussion about inheritance. He was stepping into a private struggle over trust, loyalty, and what Charles intended to leave behind. A royal will is never simply about money. In this family, every possession can represent legitimacy, every residence can signal favor, and every carefully written sentence can reopen wounds buried for decades. For Charles, Camilla, and William, the abandoned legal file suddenly becomes painfully personal. One man is confronting his mortality. One woman fears being pushed outside the future she helped build. And one son realizes his father may have been preparing him for responsibilities never discussed aloud. William watched his father search for the right words and immediately understood that this was not going to be a normal conversation. Charles tried to begin formally, referring to arrangements, responsibilities, and future protections, but the language failed him. He removed his glasses and admitted that parts of the will had become the center of a bitter legal dispute. A royal will, in this context, meant the private instructions governing possessions and arrangements personally controlled by the monarch, not the crown itself, which follows established succession rules. That difference mattered because the argument was not about who became king. It was about what remained of Charles as a husband, father, and private man after the throne moved on. The prince listened as his father explained that several personal possessions, residences, and family collections carried meaning far beyond their financial value. Charles knew one object could be interpreted as recognition, while another could be seen as rejection. He had spent years trying to avoid forcing William and Camilla into a future confrontation, yet the legal file suggested he had already imagined exactly such a fight. Camilla confronted him later, with the document still fresh in her mind. She did not ask first about money. She asked whether he had quietly decided that once he was gone, she should slowly disappear from the royal story. Charles rejected that immediately, but the queen consort pressed harder. She had seen language placing certain deeply personal possessions beyond her future control, and to her, those restrictions felt painfully close to being erased. William then learned about a protected family trust buried inside the draft. A trust is a legal structure that places property under controlled rules, so beneficiaries cannot simply change what happens to it. Several emotionally significant possessions had been placed inside that structure, shielding them from alteration after Charles's death. Another clause went even further, creating boundaries meant to prevent future disputes between Camilla's family and the direct royal line. That discovery changed the prince's expression. Charles had not merely feared disagreement, he had prepared for it. William finally asked the question his father had avoided from the beginning. If the lawyer disagreed with the wording, why had he abandoned the king completely, instead of simply rewriting it? The answer lay months earlier, inside one private confrontation that had turned a routine inheritance discussion into the moment of no return. The resignation did not begin overnight. Its roots stretched back to a closed-door meeting months earlier, when Charles attempted to settle what he believed was a practical family matter before it could become a future crisis. Instead, the conversation exposed an emotional fault line running directly through his marriage, his heir, and the legacy he intended to leave behind. Those present would later understand that afternoon as the precise moment the relationship between monarch and counsel began to collapse. Charles had been reviewing his private estate arrangements for months, trying to separate possessions with personal meaning from assets tied more directly to the crown. A private estate arrangement is simply the legal plan for property a monarch personally controls, rather than property belonging to the institution of monarchy itself. That distinction mattered, because sentimental collections, family privileges, and access to certain residences could become sources of bitterness if the wording remained unclear. His counsel had warned him more than once that vague language could turn grief into conflict. The king understood the danger, but emotion kept pulling him in opposite directions. He wanted Camilla protected from humiliation or insecurity after his death, yet he also wanted William to inherit without being dragged into arguments with his stepmother or members of her family. The balance became harder with every revision. Charles grew defensive. The lawyer, usually careful and restrained, became more direct, warning that emotional compromise inside legal wording could create consequences no one would control later. Then came the Windsor meeting everyone would remember. Charles asked for a new clause, giving Camilla continuing discretionary access to a protected private collection after his death. Discretionary access meant she could continue using or viewing certain items under agreed conditions without owning them outright. The counsel read the wording, pushed the draft back across the table, and told the king he could not recommend language that might conflict with restrictions already promised to William. Charles reacted immediately. He insisted that protecting his wife did not mean weakening his son's position, but the lawyer refused to soften the warning. The counsel reminded him that once competing promises existed on paper, intention would matter less than interpretation. The king ended the meeting abruptly, anger replacing patience. Yet the objection did not disappear with the conversation. The counsel preserved it inside the working papers. A documented notation recorded his concern beside the disputed clause. The same notation later found inside the file abandoned after his resignation. That detail changed everything, because it proved the disagreement had been building for weeks, not hours. The exchanges that followed became colder, shorter, and harder to repair. Then Charles made one more request involving Camilla, and the tension finally broke. What happened next was no longer a lawyer questioning wording. It was one of Charles's most trusted advisors telling the king, face to face, that he believed a line had been crossed. The final confrontation took place without ceremony. No aides stood between them. No cameras recorded the exchange. Charles sat opposite the counsel, who had protected his private interests for years, expecting another technical discussion. Instead, he heard words few people would ever dare direct toward a sovereign. The lawyer did not threaten him, lecture him, or raise his voice. He simply placed the proposed amendment on the table and refused to approve what Charles wanted done. Charles had asked for a revised arrangement that would give Camilla greater certainty over several personal privileges, while still preserving William's ultimate ownership of specified assets. An amendment is simply a formal change made to an existing legal document, and in this case the wording mattered, because one unclear sentence could later create competing claims. The counsel believed the new version weakened safeguards already negotiated, and could trigger exactly the kind of dispute the king had been trying to prevent. The lawyer placed his pen beside the document and looked directly at Charles. "I cannot put my name to this." The king initially assumed he meant the drafting needed another revision. He began explaining that the language could be tightened, but the counsel stopped him. This was not about phrasing. It was about principle. He believed the new clause created promises to Camilla that could collide with protections already given to William. Charles's patience broke. He argued that these were his private wishes, his family, and his responsibility. Protecting his wife, he insisted, did not mean betraying his son. The counsel did not retreat. He answered that affection was not the problem. Conflicting promises were. Once those promises were written into legal instructions, grief could turn them into weapons. Then the lawyer disclosed something Charles had not expected. He had retained a complete documented record of the earlier instructions, including each major revision and objection, because he believed the evolution of the clauses had to remain legally traceable. That meant the disagreement could not simply be erased by producing a cleaner final draft. Charles leaned forward and asked the question hanging over the room. Was the counsel suggesting that someone had improperly influenced the changes? The lawyer did not accuse Camilla, William, or anyone else. He simply refused to answer. That silence struck harder than any allegation could have. Within days, Charles ordered another review of the will. Camilla, now aware that her future security was tangled in disputed wording, demanded to know who had the authority to decide which provisions survived. The confrontation had ended, but the battle had shifted, from the wording of the will to the far more dangerous question of who actually controlled what happened next. For the first time, the struggle moved beyond emotion and into power. Charles could express his wishes, but every clause still had to survive legal scrutiny, ownership rules, trust structures, and the complicated boundary between the monarch as a private man and the crown as an institution. Camilla wanted certainty. William wanted clarity. Charles wanted peace. Yet the abandoned file revealed that achieving all three may have become impossible, and the people surrounding the king understood the stakes immediately. Charles knew even a monarch could not simply hand every royal possession to whoever he wished. Some property passed with the crown, meaning it belonged to the continuing institution of monarchy rather than to the individual sovereign, while private assets could be distributed through personal legal arrangements. That distinction mattered because the disputed will was not changing constitutional succession. It was deciding who would control personal collections, family privileges, private residences, and emotionally loaded possessions once the king was gone. William sat with his father and spoke more quietly than Charles expected. The prince said he did not want to receive anything through a settlement that made Camilla feel publicly rejected or privately humiliated. He cared about clarity but not victory. The king looked at his son with visible relief, because, for the first time in days, he understood that the future king was not fighting for objects. He was trying to prevent another royal fracture from becoming permanent. Camilla saw the situation differently. Alone with Charles, she asked whether William's growing involvement meant the future monarch was already being given authority over her life before the current reign had even ended. The queen consort feared that every new safeguard reduced her from wife to temporary beneficiary. The king tried to reassure her, but the abandoned notes were becoming harder to explain. Then Charles found the provision that changed the balance completely. The council had considered placing certain personal items into an irrevocable structure, a legal arrangement that could not simply be rewritten once established. Neither Camilla nor William would have been able to alter the final distribution for personal advantage. That meant the lawyer had been trying to remove future pressure from both sides. The next notation went even further. A protective mechanism had been drafted to stop either branch of the family from pressuring the trustees, the people legally responsible for carrying out the arrangement, after Charles's death. The king read that passage twice, because its meaning was brutal. His council had not merely disagreed with him. He had been preparing for the possibility of a battle Charles might not be alive to stop. And once the family understood what those safeguards implied, the resignation stopped looking like an act of defiance and began to resemble a warning. The most painful consequence did not arrive in a courtroom or council chamber. It came behind a closed door, when Camilla was finally shown the provisions that concerned her. She read quietly, turning one page and then another, until the legal language gave way to something unmistakably human. Charles had spent months preparing for a future in which he would no longer be there to protect her personally. And some of those protections came with boundaries she never expected. Camilla quickly understood that the draft did not leave her without security. It protected her personal support, certain privileges, and carefully defined rights, but it separated those protections from ownership of several historically sensitive items intended to remain with the direct royal line. That line meant William and his children, the branch expected to carry the monarchy forward through succession. The distinction mattered because Charles was trying to prevent future accusations that symbolic royal possessions had permanently moved outside that line. The queen consort stopped when she reached a paragraph limiting her ability to redirect certain objects later. She removed her glasses, pushed the file away, and looked directly at Charles. Her voice was controlled, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. She told him the document seemed to imagine her as someone already standing outside the family, protected perhaps, but no longer trusted to decide anything once he was gone. Charles did not answer defensively this time. He admitted that the wording had been created for the opposite reason. The king said he had wanted to spare her from a future confrontation with William by making the hardest decisions himself while he was still alive. He knew grief could make even small disputes feel like betrayals, and he feared leaving his wife and son to fight over choices he had been too afraid to settle. Then Camilla found the clause that cut deeper. One privilege she believed Charles intended to grant permanently had already disappeared from the council's final recommended version. A recommended version is the draft a lawyer believes should become the legally safest final document, even when earlier copies contain different language. She asked him when it had been removed. The king hesitated before admitting the truth. He had never made a final decision about restoring it. That meant the abandoned file contained competing versions of his intentions, some more generous to Camilla, others more protective of William. Suddenly the question was no longer what Charles had once considered. It was which version truly represented what he wanted now. Camilla closed the file. She did not demand another amendment. She asked for something far more dangerous. A private meeting with William, with no lawyers, no secretaries, and no Charles between them. For the first time since the crisis began, the people with the most to lose were about to speak, without anyone translating their fears into legal language. No counsel sat beside them, No private secretary took notes. William and Camilla entered the room carrying years of complicated history, then closed the door and confronted a future neither of them wanted to discuss. She feared being erased after Charles. He feared inheriting another unresolved family conflict. Yet without legal language separating them, something unexpected happened. The argument over ownership became a conversation about grief, memory, and the man whose death both of them dreaded imagining. William understood immediately that humiliating Camilla would not solve anything. It could wound Charles, deepen old public divisions, and turn a private inheritance settlement into another battle over loyalty. The prince also knew that some possessions carried responsibilities larger than personal affection, because they represented continuity between one reign and the next. That continuity simply meant preserving important royal items and duties for the future line, rather than treating them like ordinary family property. Camilla understood that distinction, even if accepting it still hurt. The queen consort spoke first. She told William she did not want to spend the rest of Charles's life preparing to fight him once the king was gone. The words landed heavily, because neither of them could pretend that future was distant forever. William paused before answering. He said he did not want his father's remaining years poisoned by lawyers, competing drafts, and conversations that treated death as though it were already sitting beside them. Camilla admitted what she had not said clearly before. The restrictions made her feel temporary. She had shared Charles's private life, carried public hostility beside him, and built a marriage under constant judgment. Now the wording seemed to say that when he was gone, her place could shrink into a technical permission rather than a life remembered. William did not dismiss that fear. The prince told her that protecting the direct royal line did not require pretending her marriage to his father had never mattered. Then William offered a compromise. The council's safeguards around the protected collection would remain, but Camilla would receive clear lifetime use of selected personal possessions and residences closely connected to her life with Charles. She would have security without gaining permanent control over items intended to pass with the future family line. Camilla agreed, but she added one condition. Charles had to rewrite the instructions himself. No later generation, she said, should be able to claim that William forced the settlement or that she surrendered under pressure. The agreement changed everything. Charles now faced a final choice: defend the disputed draft or replace it completely. When Charles heard what the two had agreed without him, the abandoned will ceased to be a threat and became something else entirely, an opportunity to decide what kind of legacy he truly wanted. Private family tensions rarely remain private when the monarchy is involved. Once word of the council's sudden resignation and disputed will reached the outside world, speculation erupted around a question far larger than inheritance. Had Charles been forced to choose between his wife and his heir? Headlines hardened within hours. Commentators searched every previous gesture for clues. But one public moment captured the story more powerfully than any studio debate could. Charles watched the coverage with growing unease, because the story had escaped the private boundaries he had tried so hard to protect. Palace communications refused to discuss the substance of the testament, a private legal document setting out how personal property should be handled after death, and stressed that estate planning was not the same as constitutional succession. That distinction mattered because William's place in the line to the throne was never in question. The crisis concerned family assets, private protections, and the emotional meaning attached to them. The king saw something worse happening in the public debate. His attempt to prevent a future conflict was now being presented as proof that Camilla and William were already on opposite sides. Every headline seemed to turn his wife into a rival, and his son into a challenger. Charles had wanted peace after his death, yet the disputed pages were creating division while he was still alive. William refused to make it worse. The prince told his father privately that he would not issue a public defense that made Camilla look greedy, weak, or unwanted. He reminded Charles that their private agreement mattered more than winning a day of headlines. That restraint affected the king deeply, because it proved the understanding reached behind closed doors had survived the pressure outside them. Then the public moment arrived. Outside Buckingham Palace, crowds gathered as evening editions appeared, and one front page dominated the attention around the gates: the king's final choice. Broadcasters framed the abandoned will as a test of whether Charles could keep his family united beyond his own reign. Camilla saw the headline too, and the queen consort understood that silence alone would no longer control the story. Palace officials finally confirmed one decisive fact. Charles had ordered a completely new final draft, rather than accepting either disputed version left behind by the departing council. That changed the meaning of the crisis instantly. The king was no longer defending old wording. He was preparing to replace it. Charles then sat down privately with the new instructions before him. One signature could settle the question that had divided his household for months. The resignation had exposed every fracture, but the decision Charles made next would determine whether those fractures became his legacy, or the reason he finally repaired them. The document that began the crisis would not become the document that ended it. Charles returned to the same questions that had driven his council away, but this time he approached them differently. He was no longer trying to satisfy competing demands through increasingly complicated clauses. He was deciding what he wanted his family to understand when he was no longer there to explain himself. And when the final instructions were placed before him, the king made his choice unmistakably clear. Charles commissioned an entirely fresh version and stripped away the ambiguous language that had caused so much damage. The new document kept the strongest legal safeguards from the former council while making every major intention unmistakable. A protected distribution meant certain possessions would pass according to fixed instructions rather than later pressure or negotiation. That mattered because historically significant private pieces would remain with the direct royal line, while Camilla would receive clearly defined lifetime security, personal possessions, and rights that could not be casually withdrawn. The king read the final instructions carefully before signing. He placed the pen down and asked William and Camilla to stay in the room. Then he said what months of legal argument had failed to express. Neither of them, he told them, should ever have to prove their place in his life by fighting over what he left behind. William understood immediately that this was no longer about winning an inheritance. Camilla understood that the final document was recognizing her marriage without demanding that the future king surrender responsibilities connected to the crown. Camilla became emotional as the meaning settled in. The queen consort had feared being reduced to a temporary figure in Charles's story. Yet the final wording gave her security and dignity, without turning private protection into permanent control over the royal line. William accepted the settlement without asking for more. The prince had wanted certainty, not conquest, and his restraint finally gave his father the peace he had been trying to create from the beginning. Then Charles preserved one crucial principle from the disputed papers. No beneficiary would be allowed to pressure the trustees into rewriting the protected distribution after his death. Trustees are the people legally responsible for carrying out those fixed instructions, and their independence meant neither side could later bend the settlement through emotion or influence. The safeguard that had helped trigger the crisis became the very thing that finally secured the peace. The lawyer's departure had not destroyed Charles's plans. It had forced him to confront the contradictions he had tried too long to solve quietly. The abandoned will changed everything, because it exposed a simple truth. Legacy is not measured by who receives the most, but by whether those left behind are forced to fight for proof that they mattered. The lawyer walked away. The disputed pages were replaced, and the crisis ended where it had always needed to end. Not with one side defeating the other, but with Charles finally writing a future in which his wife, his heir, and the crown no longer had to compete for his loyalty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.